final part here, chapter 19, which is our final chapter. So we're moving through the late Middle Ages, 1300 to about the year 1500. Again, historians famous or infamous for rounding things off to the nearest 100 or maybe 500. What about the next 500 years after 1500? Well, that's another course. It's called History 1520 at JCC. And I will be teaching it, so hopefully like live, face-to-face. That's the plan anyway. So if you're looking for a course in Sunni general education, Western civilization, and you're comfortable with this format, 10 quizzes over the course of the semester. By the way, we drop your lowest quizzes. We keep your best 10. What else? Lectures, hopefully more discussion, right? Face-to-face discussion. We're discussing online now for exams. Okay, so love to see you in class. And if wave number 2 of COVID hits us, I'm going to go back to this type of method, but I'm going to work out some of the kinks here. I'm kind of learning, right? Even your professors are learning, especially this semester. But I'd love to see you guys next semester. Congratulations and my sympathies as well to the graduates. Sympathies because we're not going to be able to do live in-person graduation, at least not in May. There might be something later on. And look, it's probably going to be a tough job market to start off with. But if you remember from the last lecture, after the great epidemic, really, because it didn't reach the Western Hemisphere, but the great plague of the mid-14th century, there were jobs available. So, I don't mean that as facetiously, but people are doing really well right now. What we need right now are people who study statistics, metrics, data, certainly our doctors, our nurses, our medical professionals, scientists who are hopefully developing vaccines and treatments and ways to contact, trace people. Some of those careers didn't exist when I was a JCC student myself. So, not to knock history, it's fine. Those other careers are really useful and in demand. So, crisis, let's go back to the 14th century crisis. 100 Years' War, England versus France, right in the middle of the Black Death, can you believe it? They had to put the war on pause so they could fight each other, right? But out of that, we get an England, we get a separate France, we're getting a Spain by 1492, a Portugal. We will not get a Germany or Italy yet, though, right? Because in Italy, especially in the north, we have cities that were their own countries. Once again, city-states. My goodness, we haven't talked about city-states since early in the semester. And in these city-states, there was like the 1%. Okay? The Borgias, the Medicis, these wealthy families who really kind of ruled their city-states. The city-states of northern Italy were so wealthy they could hire their own armies and like fight off entire nations like France for a time. And what do wealthy people do? Well, look, if you're wealthy, you try to gain more wealth, you try to preserve it, and you pass it on to your children. After you've done that, what's left? Impress your wealthy friends. Maybe they're not your friends, but impress other wealthy people by having exotic and rare things, like, again, spices and silk brocades, great mansions, and art. We talk about unique, right? Who buys art, original art? You got to be wealthy for the famous art. And art took on a new form. Instead of art, sculpture, even architecture, portraiture, being something done by your average workman, artists actually began to sign their work. So there's a great kind of this sense of individualism that's rising with the Renaissance. By the way, Renaissance means rebirth, right? The rebirth of European culture. Who gave you that term? The people really living through that era saw like, oh, this last several hundred years was just kind of a downer. We're going back to the age of Rome and Greece. They tried to copy Roman and Greek artistic styles and actually surpass those styles. Okay? It was beyond a Renaissance. In many ways shaping attitudes, at least in the Western world today, with regard to beauty and humanism, how the human being should be the focus of study. So, new developments in art, linear perspective. So art starts to look more three-dimensional. It's not quite like a photograph, but it's not like the real flat two-dimensional stuff of the Middle Ages either. In architecture, we have the dome. So we just did a video in the previous one on the high-pointed Gothic cathedral of the 12th and 13th centuries. By the 14th century, that's already being replaced with a dome, like a big half ball, especially over the altar of Catholic churches, and that was to emulate Roman styles. Okay. like the Pantheon in Rome itself, which still stands today, by the way. Look it up sometime. In literature, our writers begin to write about human beings. Also Christian reform, people like Erasmus. How should a Christian live in this world that was becoming increasingly commercialized? Good question, Erasmus. That's still the case today. That society was not only more commercialized, it was more urban. Okay? It was more city-based, it was more sophisticated. And this interest in the wider world will help to fuel expansion. Like what's out there, what's beyond the coast of Europe, okay? Or beyond the borders, if they exist, of Europe. La Joconde here, her real name, or the Mona Lisa, obviously one of the most famous portraits in history, comes out of this era, right? Da Vinci could invent and sing music and engage in artistry because he didn't have to farm, okay? He's not anyone's serf. He's living in, he becomes a patron, actually, of the King of France. He's living in Italy, being funded by this great wealth. China also recovering from the Black Death. The Yuans, or the Mongols, as we've been calling them, the Yuan dynasty, pushed out. So there's economic collapse, infighting within the royal palace, the impact of the plague. Look, the plague shut down the economy, people. All right, we're dealing with that a little bit today, though much, much, much worse in the 14th century. The Mongols began to retreat northward to the steppes of Asia, and China will come to be governed by, let's say, the Ming family, the Ming dynasty, led by Hongwu, who brought about centralized rule, who tried to eradicate all vestiges of the Mongol recent past. No more Mongol names, no more Mongol clothing, no more Mongol foods. We call that resinicization, by the way. Make China Chinese again and rebuild it. And the population will rebound, right, after the mid-1300s. Demographically, economically, the trade routes open up once again. Yes, we kind of have these plagues, and then they subside, and we go back to trading once again, which is the debate in the United States and really around the world right now, like when can we get the economies going again? Part of this was the voyages of Zheng He, Admiral Zheng He, sailing with hundreds of ships or cargo ships. They're like 10 times the size of what Columbus will end up with in a few decades, off the coast of China, into the South China Sea, around we'll get a map in a second, folks, the peninsula, the Malay Peninsula of Southeast Asia, and to East Africa. Some will argue that some of the Chinese explorers will go across the Pacific. That's really debatable and not a lot of evidence there. But certainly, what a great achievement. They're going from China to the east coast of Africa, and the what-ifs in history. What if they'd gone just a little bit further and rounded the Cape of Storms, or what comes to be called the Cape of Good Hope, and we're going up the Atlantic while the Portuguese were coming down, because it's only a few decades apart. It doesn't happen because, for a number of reasons, one of the interpretations is that the conservative Confucian bureaucrats believed that bringing things like giraffes from Africa to China was not really in China's best interest, right? That if China's the Middle Kingdom, it has everything it needs. It doesn't need to be out there exploring. And the big fear was that the Mongols would come back. So the Chinese begin to call back the voyages of Zheng He and others. And the ships kind of get tied up in port, and the Chinese engage in building the Great Wall of China, which was layered upon earlier attempts at a wall. Okay? So we see China, kind of by the end of this period, somewhat closing inward upon itself. Okay? The Mongols were no real threat. Meanwhile, on the other side of the eastern hemisphere, the Portuguese are venturing off of their coast, fishing. Portugal, kind of a hard-scrabble land. I've been there. It'd be beautiful land, beautiful people. A lot of cork trees. Never saw a cork tree before. Olive trees. But not a lot of arable, farmable land. So they would farm the ocean, right? They would take to the ocean and fish and construct these really durable, seaworthy vessels that will eventually become caravel ships that could ply the heavy waters of the Atlantic and they begin to move not only down the coast of Portugal, but down the coast of first North Africa and then further down the continent. They were sponsored by Prince Henry, a member of the royal family, who essentially said, go down as far as you can, map the coast of Africa, put big crosses on the shore. You'll be the third cross. The next ship will do past 3 crosses and put a 4th one up, map a bit more of it, and is pushing down the coast. And the Portuguese rediscover islands off the coast of Africa where, unfortunately, they realize sugar can be grown without having to get it from Asia or the Middle East. And even more unfortunately, why is it unfortunate? Because it will be harvested, produced and harvested and refined even by enslaved African labor. So sadly, as we close the medieval era and start the modern age, we see the birth of modern slavery. Slavery based on race, slavery based on the ultimate exploitation of the human being. The Portuguese eventually will make it to India. Just a few years after Columbus bumped into the Bahamas, they will come to dominate the coast of Africa for a long time, as well as the trade with India. But they really cut out the middlemen, who are the Ottomans. Remember the previous lecture, the Ottoman Empire, based in what is now Turkey or Anatolia, charged a high markup. If you were in Italy and you wanted to get spices or sugar, you had to pay the Ottomans, right? It's overland trade, which is more expensive to begin with, and now there's this high markup. But now the Portuguese, even though it's quite far, can go around the coast of Africa and back again and make fortunes for the Portuguese merchants and royal family. So much so that Columbus decides to go across the Atlantic to make it to the trade markets of the East. Not good math, right? Not good geography, but a lot of luck, right? Columbus thought the Earth was this big, when in fact it's like this big. It did not bump into the Bahamas. October 12, 1492. We know that because we have the primary sources, right? At least on the European side. He would have perished at sea, right? But God's support, eventually, I mean, everyone kind of turned him down. The King of Portugal, England, France. Finally, the King and Queen of Spain, or Isabella and Ferdinand, just completing the Reconquista, along with some Italian merchant money, give him 3 ships. And he makes it, right? He makes it. And the rest, as we say, is history. Hereafter, we now can talk about Atlantic history. The world becomes interconnected, but not among equals. Native American people will lose their land, their livelihoods, their culture. Will supply really the raw material for the rise of capitalism. African labor will be exploited. So Africa will unwillingly, in most cases, some African kings certainly get their hands dirty in the business of slavery, but Africa will supply the forced labor, and Europe will provide the capital. Right? The wealthy of Europe will become even more wealthy. But we'll have permanent integration globally, sustained connection. The Western Hemisphere, as you might see next semester with me, or in the future in another course, or even on your own. Right? History can be pursued by the love of it as amateurs. Right? We see permanent connection and global integration. Global integration still continues today. This is why a virus that arose really from the animal kingdom, we think, as I'm standing here in May 2020, from bats to pangolins. Pangolins, these cute scaled reptiles, interesting, right? Are they an intermediate host passed on to humans? How does that happen? Well, by engaging in illicit trade of wildlife, right? You butcher a pangolin and you can, I'm not an epidemiologist, right? But get the virus from a pangolin, right? And as that virus mutates within the human being, it's not only spread from animal to human, zootropically, but then human to human. And we think this virus is continuing to morph a bit, right? But we're also really on a fast track to develop treatments, some of which seem promising, and vaccines. It's going to be a while, probably early 2021 if we're lucky, but look, there's hope, right? So this is not the Black Death all over again by any means, right? So use this time wisely. Anyway, global integration in the world in the modern era that we're entering here at 1500 in the present is much more integrated, much more interconnected, but also in a way much more materialistic. Okay. Not to overly romanticize the Middle Ages, but in many ways the Middle Ages is interpreted as being much more communal. You and I are living on a manor. We're living in a village. We're going to church every holiday. We're drinking after church. We're really focused on friends and family. Life was probably simpler, but look, there wasn't medication either. People didn't live that long, so you have to take the good with the bad. Life today much more individualistic, and also much more secular. Speaking of disease, here we go. This is why you're remote. I'm not sneezing in. Excuse me. Life today much more secular. Even if you're a religious person, you had to be a religious person in the European Middle Ages. There was no way you could have been an atheist. It was just not possible. At least that's the thesis of some of our famous French historians of the recent past. It just wasn't part of the discourse. Everyone was religious. Today, many of us are much more scientific, right? And probably most of us are putting, while we might have faith, putting great faith as well in science to beat this pandemic. That's where we conclude the course with a more interconnected world, a world that you're going to be graduating into, that you're going to take knowledge from courses like these and many others, and reading of your own and your own experiences, and put to work, hopefully for the good of the globe. Right? And the COVID-19 crisis is teaching us some new lessons that we'll have to interpret and utilize as we move forward as well. So I wish you the best. Along with this lecture, I'm going to post, so look in the announcement section of Blackboard, the 4th exam. I'll give you the due date. You'll have several days to do it. I have asked students who missed exams previously just to email me so I can get them the exam individually, because if I post it, people are just going to get confused, right? So let's do that individually. Everything needs to be done by May 14th. I have to get grades in by May 15th, right? There's going to be a lot of time to grade, so the final exam is going to be due, goodness, I don't want to quote myself here without my notes. I believe May 12th, right? So watch announcements, and then makeups will be due by the 14th. All right, folks, stay clamped down. Let's beat this virus. Let's finish the semester strong. Let's, you're going to miss this time at some point. When you spent some really quality time with your family, with your friends, you'll look back on this, I think, with at least some good memories, and hopefully this course as well. Until then, take care. This class is history. That's all, folks.